Hello, my name is Saul France and I'm a platform engineering consultant at Ensono Digital. In this video, I'm going to be talking to you about our .NET projects and looking at deploying them to Azure using an Azure DevOps pipeline. You can find all the documentation for Ensono Stacks on the Ensono Stacks website. Here, I'm going to choose the language we're looking at. The architecture is the REST API with CQRS, and in this example, we're deploying to Azure. So here you'll find all the documentation about the project itself, how to get it installed and running locally. But for this video, we're interested in the pipelines and the infrastructure side. So I'm going to navigate to those pages now. Over on the infrastructure page, you can find out more about what resources will be provisioned in Azure, what they're used for, and also find a list of available pipelines to deploy to, which is currently only Azure DevOps for deploying to Azure. On the pipeline page, you'll find sequence diagrams for what the pipelines will do, going from feature branch to dev, and also from the main branch into production. You'll also find information on getting set up in Azure DevOps, what variable groups need to be configured, as well as the variables themselves, and a bit of an overview of the steps required to create the pipeline. I'm going to be using the Stacks CLI to generate the project for this video. You can find more information about the Stacks CLI on the Stacks website, as well as instructions on how to install it. So over in my IDE, I'm going to use the Stacks CLI interactive command to generate the project. This is going to prompt me for some information about the project I'm trying to create. So for the company, I'll just call it demo. For the scope, I will go with menu. So we're just going to go with a menu API for this. The component can be API. We're using Azure DevOps, deploying to Azure, and then it's going to ask us about where we're storing our Terraform state. So we use Terraform to provision all the infrastructure for our Stacks projects, and for Azure we assume the Terraform state will be stored in an Azure storage account, so we just need to provide the details of that. Next we'll provide information about the domain, external and internal. This isn't going to be a dry run, and we're going to use this directory, one project, one environment, and the project name I will just set to project. So I'm going to assume in this video that we've already set up the core infrastructure. That's the actual AKS cluster, the networking, and etc. So we're just going to create the actual .NET project, which will be deploying the application to AKS and the infrastructure around it. AKS is what we're deploying to. We're using the latest version. We've got a brand new GitHub repo for this, so we'll select that and I'll get the URL for the repository. And we were deploying to the West Europe region. And for the group, I'll just go with demo. So that's it for the interactive command. It's now generated a Stacks YAML file, which basically just contains all the answers to the questions that I've just provided. And it also outputs the scaffold command we need to generate the project itself. So I'll copy and paste this. And that's it, the project's generated. We can now see there's a new projects directory. And in here we've got a build folder, which contains our pipelines for Azure DevOps Azure. The CI YAML is the pipeline itself, and we've got stages for build, dev, prod, and also publishing release notes. And you can drop down into the stage and look into the actual jobs and steps involved in it as well. The CI vars file contains all the values that will be used throughout the pipeline. Most of these will be populated with your answers from the Stacks CLI interactive command, but you will need to go through and replace some, such as this group. I'll come back to this file later on and do the replacements just before we push the code up to the repository. There's a couple of other pipeline files as well as templates that are used throughout some of the steps. We also use a service called taskctl, which is essentially letting us run tasks in a way that's consistent across multiple environments as well as in your local development environment. By using containers, these tasks run identically in your pipeline as they would if you were to run taskctl on your local machine. you can see we've got commands for testing, linting, and so on. And finally, in the build directory, we've got a deployment list file, which is essentially just doing some placeholder replacements in our Helm charts value file. Over in the deploy folder, we have the Terraform that we use for provisioning infrastructure. This will create all the infrastructure in Azure that's required for this project. The deploy directory also contains the Helm chart used to deploy the application, and in the values file we can see the placeholders I mentioned earlier, which will be replaced in the pipeline with outputs from Terraform or environment variables. The templates directory also contains all the resources that will be created within Kubernetes. The SRC directory contains the actual code for the application itself, so you can look into this a little bit more there. And then finally at the root we have a Stacks CLI YAML, which basically is just used by the Stacks CLI to create the project. The taskctl YAML allows us to create taskctl pipelines, which basically combines the tasks I showed earlier. So you can see there's a lint task pipeline here, which combines the lint YAML, lint Terraform format, lint validate, instead of us having to run the commands individually. We can also specify the depends on to make sure that the tasks are ran sequentially rather than in parallel. And then the final file is the actual YAML lint configuration. So now I'm going to go back to the CI vars file and just update those values. So the first one I'm going to look at is the variable group that I showed earlier. If we go back to the documentation for the pipeline, you can find information about the variable groups there. So it does mention the CI vars file and that you should go through and manually check it. And it also mentions two variable groups that should be created. The one we're looking at now is this one where you can name it whatever you choose. And we just need to specify the Sonar token. So for Stacks, we've already got a variable group created, so I'll just populate the name here. And now I'll go through the rest of the file and make sure everything is up to date. So we've got our Terraform state config, app specific stuff, some information about the agents, some directory paths. We've got our Sonar cube configuration. So this will most likely need to be updated. We've made some assumptions based on the organization and project names. Test configuration, which should be correct. And then these are not populated, so these will need to be added. So this is the Docker container registries, the Kubernetes clusters, as well as the DNS configuration. The majority of these values come from the core infrastructure that's been created, so you just need to put in the resource groups and the names of the public IP addresses. Okay, so I'm going to go through and populate all this file now. Okay, now the file is correct and up to date. So the last step is just to change into the directory, commit all the files and push them up to the Git repository. We can see that a git init has already been performed, so I can check the remote and it is the correct URL I provided to the Stacks CLI earlier. So now I'm just going to add all the files. I will do an initial commit message and I will push everything to the master branch for now. Over in the repository, we should be able to see the files are now there, which is great. And we can move on to the steps in the documentation for setting up Azure DevOps. So back in the documentation, we can see that we need a variable group for our service principal credentials so the pipeline can talk to Azure. We already have these, so if we go to our library, we can see Azure SP creds, and this contains the credentials that the pipeline will use. You will need to obviously create these and add the correct values. The stacks.net API contains our Sonar token, and the name matches what we set in the file earlier. So now we can go over to pipelines and create the new pipeline. The instructions are found in the documentation here. So back in Azure DevOps, I click New Pipeline, select GitHub, and select the repository that we're going to be using. We're going to use an existing Azure Pipelines YAML file, and then we pass in the path, which is the CI YAML file, and click Continue. Here it'll show us the actual pipeline file itself, and I'm just going to save that for now. I didn't want to run it as it's going to run the master branch and try and deploy a production environment because that's how it's configured. So what we'll do instead is I will go back to the repository, create a feature branch, and trigger a deployment to dev using a pull request. So first I'll have to create a new branch. Just call this feature demo change, and for the purposes of simulating a change, I'll just do an empty commit and push up my branch. So that branch has now been created. If we go back to the repository, I can create a pull request. I'll leave the title and description as they are and just create the pull request. So now back in Azure DevOps, this should hopefully kick off a run. Yep, we can see that now, and click into it for some more details. As this is the first time the pipeline's been run, it will ask for permission to use the variable groups we created. So just permit them as long as they are correct. And that should kick off the pipeline once a build agent becomes available. So if we click on the build step and see a bit more detail. Yep. So we can now see it's going through the different stages defined in the pipeline YAML. So we've got the build, the dev, the prod, and we can see the different jobs for each. So it's going to check out the code base, it's going to install taskctl and pull the container images which taskctl uses. And all the subsequent taskctl tasks will use those container images to run. So it's going to go through a bit of setup, lint testing, build the functional tests, so that's so they can be used in later stages. And it's going to build the container image, and then it's going to upload some test reports and upload the functional tests, as mentioned, so it can be used in later stages of dev and prod. So this is going to take a little bit of time, so I'll fast forward this bit. Okay, so now the build stage has finished successfully, and you can click into the jobs and get a bit more details if you're interested in what's going on. But this basically means that we've now got a container image built and pushed into our container registry. So now if I go back, we can look and see that the tests report have been published. And back on the summary, we can see we need to allow another permission because this is the first time we've deployed to dev. So I'll permit that, and then that should kick off the dev stage. So this has two different jobs, one for the infra and then one for the actual deploying of the application. So the infra one should start now. And again, we can see what it's going to do. It's going to check out the code base, install taskctl, pull the container images, and deploy our infrastructure into Azure. Again, this isn't the kind of core infrastructure of AKS and the network, it's just the stuff specific to the project. So the infrastructure has been created now, so that ran successfully, which basically means everything required for this project is available in Azure now. So it's on to the final job within this stage, which is to deploy the application itself to Kubernetes. Very similar stuff. It's going to go through and install taskctl, pull the images, and then run the deploy tasks and deploy the service via Helm. Once the service is deployed, it'll also run some functional tests. Right, and that's the deploy stage finished as well, and the functional test passed. So this means the service is deployed in AKS, and we've actually been able to hit it from the pipeline. So over in Azure, we can have a quick look at the resources. There's a new resource group that's been created and a few services that are required for this one. We can see there's Azure Cosmos DB, Service Bus, Event Hub. Again, all these resources are configurable within the bar file. Over in the core resource group, we can look at the cluster and we can see there will be a new namespace for our menu API. And we can see that the service is running as well. Finally, we can also navigate to the actual website and check that the Swagger page is up and running. So that's there, which is great. So that's about everything for this video. If you'd like to find out any more information about Stacks, you can go to the Ensono Stacks website, and thank you for watching.